He was a single father who hadn't worked in 14 months. He walked 6 miles through a freezing rainstorm to reach a job interview that could change everything for him and for his son. 2 miles behind him, the billionaire CEO of the very company he was interviewing for sat warm inside her Maybach watching him through tinted glass. She didn't stop. She didn't send anyone to help. He had no idea she was there, and he had no idea the real test had already begun. The night before the interview, Ethan Price sat on the edge of a borrowed bed in a borrowed room and listened to his son breathe. Leo was 7 years old and already used to falling asleep in places that weren't theirs. First the apartment on Caldwell Street, then the shelter for 11 days, and now this narrow room at the back of Lorraine's house where the radiator ticked all night and the window frost crept in at the corners no matter how many towels you stuffed along the sill. Leo slept through all of it. He always had. Ethan was the one who lay awake counting the gaps. 14 months without steady work. 74 applications. A number he had stopped telling people because it made them look at him the way strangers look at car accidents, briefly with discomfort, then quickly away. He had a single interview scheduled for the next morning. Operations coordinator at Sterling Logistics, $52,000 a year. He had read the job posting so many times he could recite it without looking. He had printed his resume on the good paper at the library. He had ironed his only dress shirt twice. Leo had stirred earlier that evening, half awake, blinking at the ceiling. "Dad," the boy said, "if you get the job, can we have our own home?" Ethan had smoothed the blanket over his son's shoulder and said, "That's the plan, buddy." But Leo was already asleep again, and the question stayed in the room long after the answer did. He was still thinking about it when Lorraine knocked softly at the door. She was 71, a retired school teacher who had answered their ad on a community board and asked for nothing beyond a reasonable amount each month, which Ethan had been paying in partial installments and honest apologies. She handed him a folded plastic bag without a word, thick and double-layered. "Wrap your papers in that before you leave," she said. "Charlotte Winters don't care what day it is." He looked at the bag. He looked at her. "Thank you, Miss Lorraine." She waved him off and went back down the hall. He laid the bag on top of his folder and finally went to sleep. By 6:45 the next morning, he already knew something was wrong. The transit app refreshed twice, then showed a service alert in Red Route 12 suspended due to flooding on Beatty's Ford Road. No estimated time of restoration. Ethan stood at the bus shelter in his dress shirt and his old sneakers, the ones with the worn-through left sole, and stared at his phone. His bank account read $6.40. He checked the rideshare apps out of habit. Lyft was surging at $22, Uber at $19. He checked the transit app again as if it might have changed its mind. It hadn't. The interview was at 9 o'clock sharp. The Sterling Logistics Tower was 6 miles away in the heart of uptown Charlotte. The rain was coming down in long, cold sheets, the kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as press against your coat, your shoulders, the back of your neck. The temperature hovered just above freezing. He had exactly 2 options. Go back inside and call to reschedule and risk losing the slot entirely, which was the kind of gamble he already knew the outcome of, because 14 months had taught him what happened when you let a door close even halfway. Or walk. He went back inside for 3 minutes. He wrapped his resume, his references, and his cover letter inside Lorraine's plastic bag and sealed it tight. He slid his dress shoes into his backpack to keep them dry. He laced up his old sneakers. He checked on Leo one more time, still asleep, one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress, and he pulled the door shut without a sound. Then he stepped back out into the rain and started walking. 2 miles behind him, a black Maybach rolled slowly along the same route, its wipers moving in quiet intervals. Grayson Sterling was 52 years old, and she had built Sterling Logistics from a single warehouse in South Carolina into a regional powerhouse that now moved freight across 11 states. She was the kind of executive whose name appeared in business journals and whose number appeared in very few phone contacts. She did not believe in sentiment. She had stopped believing in it 3 years ago when the man she had trusted most, her co-founder, her closest advisor, the person who knew every password and every contingency, had taken $23 million and a flight to Lisbon and sent her a single email that read, "It was always business." Since then, her philosophy had simplified considerably. Words were free. Behavior was the only currency she trusted. She had a habit known to no one outside her executive assistant of visiting the neighborhoods of final round candidates before their interviews, not to intimidate, not to investigate, simply to watch, to see how they moved through ordinary life when no one who mattered was looking. She had arrived at Ethan Price's block at 6:30 and had seen him leave the house at 6:52. She had told her driver Owen to maintain a 2-mile gap and to keep the headlights low. She watched him walk through the rain with his backpack pulled close and his shoulders forward against the wind. She watched him step around a puddle that stretched across half the sidewalk. She watched him check his phone once, then put it away and keep moving. Owen glanced in the rearview mirror. "You want me to pull up, Ms. Sterling?" "No," she said. "It's 38 degrees." "I know what the temperature is, Owen." He said nothing more. She lifted her espresso and turned back to the window. She had interviewed hundreds of candidates in her career. She had been impressed by credentials, by confidence, by the particular kind of polish that expensive education and family money tend to produce. She had hired several of those people. Some had been excellent. Some had taken the first better offer that came along. One had taken $23 million and flown to Lisbon. She was not sure what she was looking for exactly. She only knew she would recognize it when she saw it or when she didn't. The machinery that decides who gets a chance in this country often runs on factors that have nothing to do with ability. Ethan Price had no car because he had no income. He had no income because he'd had no job for 14 months. And on this particular morning, he couldn't even reach the interview that might have broken that cycle because the bus that connected his neighborhood to the city's center had been suspended, and the cost of an alternative was 3 times what he had in his account. This is not a story about bad luck. It is a story about the invisible walls built into systems that claim to be neutral walls that most people never have to notice because they've never been on the wrong side of one. I've read enough success narratives to know how they're supposed to work. The hero suffers, perseveres, and earns the reward. What those narratives rarely examine is how many people with equal perseverance never got the interview at all because the bus didn't run, or the suit wasn't right, or the address on their resume was the wrong zip code. Ethan's walk wasn't heroic because it was exceptional. It was heroic because the system gave him no other option and he chose to move anyway. When the hardest doors in life close without warning, the only question that remains is whether you move toward the next one or stand still in the cold. Ethan Price had no car, no money, and no guarantee of anything waiting for him at the end of 6 miles. What he had was a plastic bag his landlady had pressed into his hands the night before the memory of a question his son had asked half asleep and 2 legs that still worked. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes it has to be. He made it 4 blocks before the truck hit him with the puddle. It came from the left, a black pickup running too fast through a flooded intersection, its tires catching the standing water along the gutter and throwing it outward in a wide, flat arc. The wave caught Ethan across his left side from the hip to the shoulder. He stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk in the rain that was already falling on him now, also covered in the cold, gray water of a Charlotte street, and he did not move for a full 3 seconds. Then he unzipped his backpack and checked the plastic bag. The documents inside were dry, every page untouched. He pressed the seal tighter, re-zipped the bag, and thought of Lorraine's hands pressing the plastic into his the night before. He exhaled slowly through his nose, turned his face back into the wind, and kept walking. In the Maybach, Grayson watched him check the bag. She watched him find what he was looking for, the small confirmation that the thing he had protected was still intact, and she watched him keep going without looking back at the truck. Owen said nothing this time. He had learned in 4 years of driving Grayson Sterling which silences were invitations and which were walls. By the time Ethan reached the 4.5-mile mark, the cold had worked its way past his shirt and settled somewhere behind his sternum. His left sneaker had soaked through completely. He walked with his jaw set and his eyes on the middle distance, counting blocks the way he used to count dollars at the end of the month, carefully without sentiment because the number was the number, and feeling bad about it didn't change it. A silver Honda Accord pulled alongside him and slowed to a stop. The passenger window came down and a man in his mid-50s leaned across from the driver's seat. He had a kind face, the kind that looks worried on behalf of other people. "Hey, you need a ride? I've got the heat on. I'm heading downtown." Ethan looked at the car. He looked at the man. Every physical instinct he had said to open the door and sit down. He thought about Leo. Not the Leo who had asked his question and fallen back asleep, but the Leo who would eventually be old enough to ask how things had gone, how his father had handled the hard mornings, the ones where the weather didn't cooperate, and the options ran out and you still had to find a way to show up. He wanted to be able to answer that question honestly. "Thank you," Ethan said. "I appreciate it. I'd rather finish this one on my own." The man looked at him for a moment, then nodded slowly, not the nod of someone who doesn't understand, but the nod of someone who does. The window went up. The Accord pulled away. Inside the Maybach, Grayson Sterling set down her espresso. She had not expected that. She had seen candidates perform resilience before, had watched people manufacture suffering for the sake of an impression. But you could not manufacture what she had just seen because no one performs for an audience they don't know exists. The man in the rain had no idea anyone was watching. He had declined a warm car and a dry seat because he had decided for reasons she couldn't fully see yet that this mile belonged to him. The memory came without invitation the way it always did when she least wanted it. Her mother, 30 years ago. A steel-cold night in November, the family's Buick dead in the driveway with a cracked alternator they couldn't afford to replace until the following Friday. Her mother had wrapped herself in 2 coats, kissed Grayson's forehead, and walked 12 miles to make the night shift at the textile plant. She hadn't complained. She hadn't called in. She had simply calculated what needed to happen and made it happen with whatever she had available. Grayson had not thought about that night in years. She had, in fact, worked very deliberately to stop thinking about it, because the memory had a way of making the life she'd built feel both earned and insufficient at the same time, and that was not a feeling she had any use for. She reached for her phone and called the front desk. "Janine," she said when the receptionist picked up. "When the price candidate arrives, have a black coffee waiting for him. No sugar." He reached the Sterling Logistics Tower at 8:51. The lobby was marble and glass and aggressively warm. Ethan found the men's room near the elevator bank and spent the next 7 minutes doing what he could. He blotted the worst of the water from his face and neck with paper towels. He wrung out his jacket over the sink. He ran a hand through his hair until it lay flat. He changed out of his soaked sneakers and into the dress shoes from his backpack, which were perfectly dry. He checked his reflection in the mirror. The left shoulder of his shirt still held a faint watermark, a half moon of shadow that wouldn't fully disappear, and decided that it was what it was. He picked up his backpack and went upstairs. The 4th floor waiting area had 4 chairs arranged around a low table with a bowl of wrapped mints no one was touching. 3 other candidates were already seated. All 3 were dry. All 3 wore suits that had clearly not been purchased with a payment plan. The one nearest the window had the tilted back posture of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any given room. He wore a watch face-out on his wrist, and a suit that fit the way suits fit when they are made for a specific body rather than adjusted for one. His eyes moved over Ethan when he walked in with the brief efficiency of someone who had already formed a conclusion. "You swim here," he said loud enough for the other 2 candidates to hear. "Or did the bus not have a roof?" One of the other candidates looked at the floor. The third made a quiet sound that could have been a laugh. Ethan took the remaining chair, set his backpack down, and pulled out his resume. He read it from the top as though he were seeing it for the first time, making sure every number and date was where he needed it to be. The man nearest the window took out his phone. A minute later, he was talking into it at the volume of a man who has never had to worry about being overheard. "No, it's basically done," he was saying. "Dad knows Whitaker's old supervisor from the Pinnacle Group. I mean, it's still a formality, but yeah." He laughed at something on the other end. "Brent Holloway doesn't lose on a formality." Exactly. He hung up and turned to the receptionist at the desk, a composed woman in her 30s whose nameplate read Janine. "Hey, any chance you could bump me to the first slot? I've got a working lunch that I really can't move." Janine looked up from her screen with an expression that had clearly been trained to remain pleasant under all conditions. "I'm sorry, the order was set by the hiring team. I'm not able to adjust it." Brent's fingers started a slow rhythm against his knee. He looked at his watch. He looked at the door. He was a man accustomed to the minor accommodations that ease a life, and the absence of one, even a small one, appeared to produce in him something close to genuine distress. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He saw Leo's face from that morning, the boy still half asleep, hair pressed flat on one side, one sock on, and one sock somewhere under the blanket. He opened his eyes and went back to his resume. Janine came around from the desk carrying a white ceramic mug. She placed it on the table beside Ethan's chair. "For you," she said quietly. "Black, no sugar. Someone asked us to have it ready." He looked at the mug. He looked at her. She offered nothing more and returned to her desk. He wrapped both hands around the ceramic and sat with it for a long moment, letting the warmth move through his palms and up into his wrists. He didn't know who had sent it. He didn't try to figure it out. He only knew it was the first warm thing he had felt all morning, and it steadied him in a way that was difficult to explain. Brent went in second. Ethan went in third. The conference room on the 5th floor had a long, oval table and a window that looked out over the rain-gray skyline. A man in his mid-40s sat at the far end, Dean Whitaker, Vice President of Operations, who had the manner of someone who had conducted enough interviews to stop finding them interesting. He gestured to the chair across from him without standing. The first 15 minutes went reasonably well. Ethan walked through his logistics experience, his certification in supply chain coordination, his understanding of the software platforms they used. He spoke clearly. He did not over-explain. Then Dean leaned back and looked at the resume with the expression of a man who has found exactly what he was expecting to find. "There's a 14-month gap here," he said. "Walk me through that." Ethan walked him through it. The company downsizing, the severance that covered 2 months, the custody complications after the separation, the 74 applications. Dean nodded slowly. "And the single-parent situation, I have to ask, because the role involves regional travel, late coordination calls, weekend coverage during peak season. That's a real operational demand. How does your home setup support that kind of schedule?" It was a legal borderline of a question, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. Before Ethan could answer, the conference room door opened. Grayson Sterling walked in without knocking, because it was her building. She took the chair to Dean's left and set a single notepad on the table. She looked at Ethan, at his face, at his posture, at the faint watermark still visible on his shoulder with the directness of someone who does not consider staring to be rude. "I have one question," she said. "Why didn't you ask to reschedule when you saw the weather this morning? We would have accommodated you. You could have called, explained the situation, and moved it to tomorrow." She kept her eyes on him. "Instead, you walked 6 miles in 38 degrees and arrived looking like this. Tell me why." The room held the question in the air between them. Ethan met her gaze. "Because I've been waiting for this interview for 14 months, he said. "I've been turned down 74 times. This morning the bus was canceled and I had $6.40 in my account, and the cheapest ride I could find was $19. So I had 2 options." He kept his voice level. "I could call and reschedule and hope the slot was still there tomorrow, or I could use what I had. I had 2 working legs and enough time if I left immediately. The rain could make me wet. It didn't have the right to take this opportunity away from me." He set his hands flat on the table. "My son asked me last night if we could have our own home if I got this job. That question was still in my head when I stepped outside this morning. I didn't want to have to explain to him that I had waited for tomorrow." From down the hall came the sound of a door opening, then footsteps moving toward the elevator. Brent Holloway's interview had ended ahead of schedule. Later that afternoon, as Janine was processing the day's candidate files, she mentioned it to Ethan in passing that the second candidate had been given a crisis scenario and hadn't found his footing, that the panel had wrapped things up early. She said it without editorial, the way someone states a fact that explains itself. Grayson said nothing immediately. She looked at the man across the table, wet shoes, dry documents, steady hands, and wrote something on her notepad. Then she turned it face down. "Look at that waiting room. The one where Brent Holloway made phone calls about his connections, while Ethan Price read his resume for the 100th time. That room is an almost perfect diagram of how modern hiring systems actually function. They are designed to recognize the signals of people who have never needed the job badly. Clean employment history, unbroken timelines, the right shoes on the right day. A gap in the resume, even one caused by layoffs or illness, or the ordinary catastrophe of life, gets coded as a red flag. A watermark on a shoulder becomes an indicator of poor judgment. The system doesn't ask how the person got there. It asks whether they arrived looking the way it expected. What I keep coming back to is this: Brent walked into that building having done almost nothing to earn his confidence. His father knew someone. His suit was dry because he had driven there. His hands were steady because very little had been required of them that morning. And yet the same system that nearly screened Ethan out before he opened his mouth would have moved Brent to the next round without question. We talk a great deal about meritocracy. We talk considerably less about what we actually measure when we claim to be measuring merit. Your clothes can get soaked. Your shoes can let the water in. The morning can turn against you before 7 o'clock. None of that can touch what you have decided about yourself, who you are, what you came for, and what you will not allow a rainstorm to take away. The loudest person in the waiting room is rarely the most prepared. And the most important thing you carry into any room is not on your resume. It is the knowledge, clear and unshakable, of exactly why you walked through the door. Dean Whitaker spoke first because silence in his conference rooms made him uncomfortable. "I appreciate the candor," he said in the tone of a man who appreciated very little about what he had just heard. He clicked his pen twice and looked at his notepad. "But I do have to weigh that against the overall profile. 14 months is a significant gap. The single-parent logistics—" "Dean," Grayson's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "Give us the room." Dean looked at her. He looked at Ethan. He gathered his notepad and his pen and his coffee and left without another word, pulling the door shut behind him. Grayson Sterling and Ethan Price sat across from each other at the long oval table, with the rain moving against the windows and the gray Charlotte skyline behind her and the dry documents in the plastic bag on the chair beside him. She studied him the way she studied freight manifests, looking for the thing that didn't add up the variance that revealed whether the numbers meant what they appeared to mean. "You said the rain didn't have the right to take this from you," she said. "That's an interesting way to put it." "It's the way I meant it," Ethan said. She wrote something on her notepad. She turned it over so he couldn't read it. 90 days, she said. "Provisional. You'll be evaluated at 30, 60, and 90. If the evaluation at 90 doesn't support a permanent offer, you'll be released with 2 weeks severance. Is that acceptable?" Ethan took one breath. "Yes." "Good." Grayson stood and picked up her notepad. "Janine will process the paperwork this afternoon. You'll start Monday." She walked to the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. She did not turn around. "Dress for the weather next time, Mr. Price. We need people here who think ahead." She walked out. Ethan sat alone in the conference room with the rain on the glass and his hands flat on the table and a feeling in his chest that had no precise name, not quite relief, not quite joy, but something underneath both of them, something more like ground. In the private elevator on the way down to her car, Grayson stood with her notepad pressed flat against her side and thought about her mother's coat. It had been a green wool coat secondhand with 2 of the 4 buttons replaced by ones that didn't quite match. Her mother had worn it for 11 winters. When Grayson had been old enough to earn money of her own, the first thing she had wanted to buy was a better coat. But by then her mother had said the old one was fine. It still kept the wind out and there was no point replacing something that still did its job. Grayson had built a company worth several $100 million. She owned 4 coats, none of them green, all of them excellent. And she had spent the last 3 years using the wound from one man's betrayal as a reason to keep everyone at the same measured distance, interviewable, auditable, observable, but never fully trusted. She pressed the lobby button and watched the floors count down. What she had seen today was not performance. It was not strategy. It was a man who had $6.40 and a plastic bag and a question from his 7-year-old son still ringing in his ears. and who had made the only calculation available to him and then executed it without complaint. That was, she thought, the only kind of person she actually wanted running her operations. The internal deliberation lasted 40 minutes. Dean laid out his case methodically in the small conference room adjacent to HR. The employment gap, the custody situation, the below-average score on the written assessment, the fact that 3 other candidates had cleaner profiles. He was not wrong about any of it. He was simply measuring the wrong things, and Grayson waited until he had finished before she said so. "What you're describing is a profile that looks manageable on paper," she said. "I'm not interested in manageable. I'm interested in what happens when the system fails, when the software gives bad data, when a shipment goes sideways at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, when a client calls threatening to walk and there's no script that covers the situation." She set her pen down. The man kept a folder of documents dry through 6 miles of a rainstorm in a plastic bag. He turned down a warm car because he didn't want to arrive at a finish line someone else had carried him to. That's not a gap in his resume, Dean. That's the entire resume. Dean looked at his notes. His steer point scores were, "Software can be learned," Grayson said. "Character takes 30 years. Ethan Price was hired. He started the following Monday. The first 2 weeks were unremarkable in the way that new beginnings often are full of small competencies being demonstrated quietly without audience. Ethan learned the team. He learned the dispatch system. The routing software, the regional depot contacts the names of the drivers who responded well to direct communication and the ones who preferred to be left alone until there was a problem. He stayed late without being asked not to be seen staying late, but because the hours between 5 and 7 were the only ones when the office was quiet enough to actually think. It was on a Friday in his 3rd week that he found it. He had been cross-referencing the winter routing data on SteerPoint against a set of physical maps he had printed from the regional depot files, a habit that his former supervisor had called unnecessary, and that Ethan had never been able to stop because numbers on a screen and roads on paper had always told him slightly different stories. He found the discrepancy at 9:47 in the evening in an empty office, lit by a single desk lamp and the glow of 2 monitors, 3 trucks, 2 overlapping corridors on the I-77 and I-85 interchange, the same 6-hour window 3 days a week. The SteerPoint system had flagged none of it because the routes were technically valid, they just weren't efficient. They produced redundant fuel costs, compressed delivery windows, and an average delay of 90 minutes per affected load. He ran the numbers 3 times because the first 2 felt too clean. He wrote the report in plain language, attached the corrected routing models, and emailed it to Dean Whitaker at 11:12 that night. He included no commentary beyond the data and a single line at the end. Happy to walk through this in person if useful. Dean did not respond that night. He did not respond over the weekend. On Monday morning, Grayson Sterling called Ethan into her office at 8:15, the first time she had summoned him directly since his hire. Her office was on the 7th floor, and it was not what he had expected. It was spare, almost austere, a large desk, 2 chairs, a single-framed photograph of a manufacturing facility he didn't recognize, and a window that looked east over the city. No awards on the walls, no visible credentials, just the tools of the work itself. She had his report on her desk printed and marked with a single line of handwriting across the top. "Sit down," she said. "Who taught you to read routes this way?" "No one," Ethan said. When I was managing household expenses, I used to go through every line item and ask whether it was doing what it was supposed to do. I applied the same logic." Grayson looked at the report, then she looked at him. "This adjustment, if we implement it across the full winter schedule, saves us roughly $168,000 annually." She said it the way people state facts that have already been decided. "I'm approving it this morning. I'm also telling Dean that your 30-day evaluation will reflect this finding." She turned back to her desk, which was the way she ended conversations. Ethan stood to leave. "Mr. Price," she said without looking up. "That's good work?" He said thank you and went back downstairs to his desk and did not make anything of it because there was more work to do. The Meridian Foods call came on a Wednesday morning in his 8th week at 6:53 before most of the team had arrived. He had been in early as usual, reviewing the overnight dispatch reports with a cup of coffee from the break room that was considerably worse than the one Janine had brought him on the morning of his interview. His desk phone rang and the caller ID read Meridian Foods, Regional Procurement. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Carl, who had the tight, over-controlled tone of someone trying to sound professional while furious. "I'm going to be direct with you," Carl said. "We have a $2.3 million contract with Sterling, and right now I have a refrigerated load sitting 11 hours behind schedule because of a backup on I-85. I've got product with a temperature threshold and a retail window, and I've got clients on the other end who are going to start calling me in about 2 hours. I'm going to need to have a serious conversation about whether this relationship still makes sense." Ethan pulled up the dispatch manifest on his screen while Carl was still talking. He found the load, a refrigerated shipment out of the Greensboro depot, rerouted twice overnight due to a multi-vehicle incident that had closed the northbound lanes of I-85 for 6 hours. He saw the current truck position. He saw the product specs. He did the math on the temperature window while Carl finished. "Carl, I hear you," Ethan said. "I'm not going to tell you the delay was acceptable because it wasn't. Here's what I can tell you right now." He kept his voice even, unhurried, the voice of someone who has thought through what he is about to say and means it. "We have a secondary truck available out of the Greensboro depot that can pick up half the load within 90 minutes and run a direct route, no additional stops. The remaining half goes on the original truck with priority status. We split the delivery into 2 windows, which actually gets part of your product to the retail end faster than the original single delivery schedule would have. For the delay on this load, we'll absorb the refrigerated storage fees on your end. I'll get that in writing before noon." Carl was quiet for a moment. "And what about next time the highway shuts down?" he said. "I can't promise you I-85 won't close again," Ethan said. "I can promise you that when it does, someone will be at their desk before 7 in the morning already working the problem. That's what I can control. That's what I'm offering." Another silence. Longer. "Get me the split delivery confirmation by 9, Carl said, "and the storage fee waiver. You'll have both by 8:30. Meridian Foods renewed their contract the following quarter. Dean Whitaker, to his credit, mentioned it in the next all-hands meeting and gave Ethan the full attribution. 2 years passed in the way that good years pass, not in a blur, but in an accumulation of small things done well. Ethan moved out of Lorraine's back room and into a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of Charlotte with a working radiator and a bedroom door that Leo could close all the way. Leo got a shelf for his books and a window that faced east and caught the morning light. Ethan got a commute that took 11 minutes. His title changed to Regional Operations Director 18 months in, after he had overseen the integration of 2 new depot facilities and rebuilt the carrier communication protocol from scratch in a way that reduced disputed deliveries by 31%. Dean, to everyone's surprise, including his own, became one of Ethan's more reliable allies inside the company because Dean, whatever his limitations, respected results. Grayson called Ethan into her office again on the day the promotion was finalized, and she said very little beyond the formal confirmation of the role and its terms. But as he was leaving, she said something that stayed with him. "You know what I wrote on my notepad in that interview room?" she asked. He said he didn't. "I wrote keeps the documents dry." She looked out the window at the city below. "I've hired a lot of people in my life, Ethan. That was the first time I ever used that as a criterion." The initiative had no official origin story in any board meeting or strategic plan. It began as most meaningful things do, with a specific memory and a specific person. Grayson had been reviewing the HR onboarding data for the quarter when she noticed a pattern. 3 of their most recent quality hires had flagged transportation as a barrier during their first month, and 2 had mentioned childcare costs as a source of ongoing pressure. She pulled the exit interview data for the past 2 years and found the same variables appearing repeatedly in the departure reasons of people who had been performing well. She called Ethan. They spent 3 weeks designing it together. The program they eventually launched was called the 6 Miles Initiative, and it provided transportation assistance, subsidized childcare coordination, and a structured mentorship track specifically for candidates and employees who were single parents or who faced significant logistical barriers to consistent employment. It was not charity, it was structured support with clear expectations because both of them had agreed from the beginning that the goal was to remove the structural obstacles, not to reduce the dignity of the people navigating them. The first allocation of funds went to 2 new hires who had flagged transportation costs during onboarding. The second covered emergency childcare for a warehouse supervisor whose regular provider had closed without notice. The third went to Lorraine. It was Ethan's decision, and Grayson didn't ask him to justify it. He had calculated carefully the amount that corresponded to the 18 months of partial and late rent payments he had made from Lorraine's back room, the months when she had accepted what he had, and said nothing about the rest. He added the months she had never invoiced at all. He had the check cut through the program's community support fund and delivered it himself on a Saturday morning at her front door. Lorraine looked at the check for a long time. She looked at Ethan. She did not ask where it came from or how he had calculated the amount. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I wanted to." She put the check in the pocket of her cardigan and went inside to make coffee. And he sat at her kitchen table for an hour, and they talked about Leo's reading level and the state of the neighborhood, and the particular unreliability of Charlotte weather, and it was of all the things that had happened in 2 years, one of the most ordinary and the most complete. 2 years after the morning he had walked 6 miles through the rain. Ethan drove Leo to school on another storm morning, the kind where the wipers can barely keep up and the gutters run like shallow rivers along every curb. Leo was 9 years old now, sitting in the back seat with his backpack on his lap, watching the rain hit the window in long diagonal lines. "Dad," he said, "is it cold outside?" "Pretty cold," Ethan said. "Are you cold?" Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror at his son's face, the same dark eyes, the same directness that had always been there. "No, buddy," he said, "I've got the car." It was a simple answer to a simple question. But it carried beneath its plainness the whole weight of what it had taken to be able to say it, the 14 months, the 74 rejections, the $6.40, the 6 miles, the plastic bag. None of which Leo could fully understand yet, and all of which would be his to know when he was ready. Ethan dropped him at the school entrance, watched him run through the rain with his backpack held over his head, and pulled back out onto the street. He saw the young man 3 blocks later. He was walking on the right side of the road, moving with his head down against the wind, both arms wrapped around a plastic bag he was holding flat against his chest. He wore a dark jacket that was soaked through across the shoulders. He was moving with the particular focus of someone who has decided where they are going and is not going to stop regardless of the weather, but whose body is beginning to register the cost of that decision. Ethan did not think about it. He pulled the car to the curb, put it in park, and lowered the passenger window. The young man looked up. He had the wariness of someone who has learned to be careful about unexpected kindness. The slight calculation behind the eyes, the weight shifted back onto the rear foot. "I'm not going to keep you long," Ethan said. "Where are you headed?" "Uptown," the young man said. "Job interview. Transit's messed up." Ethan looked at him for a moment, at the bag pressed to his chest, at the waterlogged jacket at the set of the jaw that said he was going to make it there regardless. "Get in," Ethan said. "I've been exactly where you're standing." The young man held his gaze for a second. Then he got in. They rode in mostly comfortable silence through the rain. Ethan didn't offer advice. He didn't tell his story. He turned the heat up and took the direct route and let the young man collect himself for the 12 minutes it took to reach the uptown corridor. When he pulled up to the address the young man gave him, they sat for a moment with the rain on the roof and the engine running. "Thank you," the young man said. "Seriously." "Good luck in there," Ethan said. "You've already done the hard part." The young man got out, tucked the bag tighter under his arm, and went through the glass doors. Ethan watched him go. Then he checked his mirrors, signaled, and pulled back into traffic. The rain moved across the windshield in the same long diagonal lines it always had, and he let the wipers handle it and drove. Here is the thing worth sitting with. Ethan did not stop because he had a policy about helping people, or because he had been told to, or because stopping would make him feel good about himself. He stopped because he saw a plastic bag pressed against a chest in the rain, and he remembered not abstractly, but physically in his hands what it felt like to be the person holding it. That is the difference between pity and recognition. Pity observes from a distance and feels sad. Recognition pulls over. Grayson Sterling had watched Ethan walk 6 miles and had called it a test. In a sense, she wasn't wrong. But the deeper test, the one that the morning on the road with the Accord driver had actually revealed, was never about endurance. It was about what a person chooses to carry and what they refuse to put down. He carried the documents. He carried his son's question. He carried his own sense of what he owed himself at the finish line. He put down the ride. He put down the excuse. He put down the option of letting the weather decide. 2 years later, on a different rainy morning, he put down 6 minutes of his commute to give someone else the only thing that had ever been in genuinely short supply: a person willing to stop. The most important thing a person can do when they finally get out of the rain is remember that it is still raining for someone else. Not to feel guilty about having a dry coat. Not to pretend the hard years didn't cost what they cost. But to hold both things at once: the difficulty of where you came from and the responsibility that comes with where you've arrived. Lorraine gave Ethan a plastic bag because it was the most useful thing she had. He walked 6 miles because his legs were the most reliable resource available. He declined a warm car because his integrity was the one asset he refused to compromise. None of these were grand gestures. They were simply the best application of what was at hand. That is, in the end, the whole of it. Not the promotion, not the initiative, not the parking space in the Sterling garage. The whole of it was a 9-year-old boy in the back seat asking his father if he was cold, and a father who could say no because he had spent 2 years building a life where the answer was finally, simply, plainly true.